I'm Vicky Donnellan. I'm Catalogue Manager at the British Museum, and welcome to my corner.
This film focuses on a Roman sculpture and discusses themes of an adult nature.
The object that I'm talking about today is this marble sculpture of a nymph and satyr. These are figures from Greek myth, and their bodies are intertwined in a scene of attempted sex. It's been brought out of storage to replace the object that's usually displayed here, which is away on loan, and this gives us a great chance to highlight it. It has a really fascinating story, and I'm going to talk a bit about the times it's been put on display, and even more interestingly, the times it's been taken off display. But as I'm the catalogue manager, I'm also going to tell a story of cataloguing and documentation, and that's going to take us into the museum's archives. But first, let's talk a little bit more about the sculpture. It was made around the 2nd century AD, and it's a copy, one of a number of versions, of an earlier Greek statue, which would have been made in the 2nd century BC. The female figure is a nymph. A nymph is a minor divinity in Greek myth. They're associated with wild and remote rural places. The male figure has animal ears, and these identify him as a satyr, one of the part human, part horse followers of the god of wine, Dionysus. So we're in the world of Dionysus, which is a kind of fantasy space in Greek myth, which allowed the expression of the kinds of behaviour that just weren't appropriate in normal polite society. And that includes unrestrained lust. So the satyr is trying to have sex with the nymph. He's got his arms wrapped around her. She is resisting. She's trying to pull his arms away with one hand. She's pushing his head back with the other. As we see this sculpture now, it has a sort of almost carefree and playful air, and that's largely down to the expression of the nymph. She's turning towards the satyr, and she's sort of half smiling. But we don't know whether this was her original expression, because the head was restored in the late 18th century. Imagine now that her expression was more anguished, that she was turning away. I think that would change the way we react to this sculpture. It would make the violence much more obvious. Other parts of the sculpture are restored too, including parts of the arms of the nymph, but there's one part that isn't restored. And I think if that was present, it would also make the sculpture much more confronting. We know that the nymph's head isn't original because we can see it on the sculpture. There's a join that you can just see between the head and the neck. But to find out more, we have to go and look in the museum's archives. This sculpture was acquired by the British Museum in 1805, and we know this if we look at its identifying number, which is 1805-0703.2, and that means that it was the second object acquired in a group that came to the museum on the 3rd of July 1805. It was acquired from a man called Peregrine Townley, the nephew of a very famous collector of classical antiquities, Charles Townley, whose collection this came from. So we're now in the round reading room of the British Museum, where we've come to look at some archival material. As well as the collection of objects, the museum has a substantial archive of Charles Townley's correspondence, inventories, account books, much of which was purchased later in the 1990s. It gives us a really rich set of insights into his collection of sculptures, including the nymph and satyr. You can see information about the nymph and satyr in this list of his sculptures. A group small life of a faun and a nymph. And this entry tells us that the sculpture was found in April 1773 by Signor Domenico de Angelis. And it was found in a villa, which is known as Cassius's Villa, which is just outside Tivoli, near Rome. And this entry also tells us about the head of the nymph. It says, the head of the nymph, which is wanting, which I read as meaning that it was missing at the time of discovery. And it says here that it had been restored anciently. It continues in very difficult handwriting, the ancient something seen still in the neck. And this perhaps means a fixing was still visible, left from that ancient restoration. And then Townley continues, I caused it to be restored by, and he leaves a blank here, as though he doesn't know the name, called the Spocino. And it's known now that Lo Sposino, which means kind of little husband, was a nickname given to a sculptor of the period called Giovanni Pierantoni. This second document, which is a list that Townley's written with original costs of his sculptures, lists the sculpture right at the top here. And he paid, it says, £350 for this sculpture, which he acquired from the dealer Thomas Jenkins. Now, this was the second highest amount he'd paid for a sculpture to this date. And he then later strikingly values it at £1,500, which again is a very high amount compared to the rest of the items on the list. It's probable that one of the reasons he valued this sculpture so highly is the sexual theme of the sculpture. We know that the circle of connoisseurs and collectors of classical antiquities that Charles Townley was part of, they were a bit of a kind of gentleman's club. They weren't averse to a bit of innuendo, a bawdy joke. And they also had a serious interest in sexual themes in classical art as part of a kind of primitive theology. In fact, one of Townley's close associates, Richard Payne Knight, published a work called The Discourse on the Worship of Priapus in 1786, which had caused quite a scandal when it came out. And we see Townley and some of his associates, along with his sculptures, including the nymph and satyr, in a wonderful painting by Johann Zoffany, which shows the nymph and satyr in the corner of Townley's library. Now, this isn't necessarily an accurate portrayal of exactly where it was found. This is a sort of imaginative piece that gathers together Townley's sculptures in his home in Park Street. But we do know from another drawing, which is in the British Museum's collection, also acquired from Townley, that the nymph and satyr is shown again in this very similar position, although set back into an alcove. And the ordering of the sculptures in one of Townley's own catalogues does seem to reflect this arrangement, making it likely that this is actually where it was displayed. This painting is what's known as a conversation piece, and it would have been commissioned by Townley. And it's probably not an accident that the three friends are shown in and amongst a cluster of particularly sexually themed objects. It's probably part of a kind of in-joke for this group of gentlemen friends. Townley's home in Park Street was open to the public as a kind of a museum. Visitors could come and look at the sculptures there, and they were provided with catalogues like these to help them to understand what they saw. It's interesting to look at how the nymph and satyr was described in these catalogues and later catalogues in the context of changing attitudes to sex, among other things. So this listing was produced in the 1780s. It says a group of the fawn struggling with a nymph. It doesn't explicitly reference the sexual nature of the theme, but it does sort of hint at it in some of the phrases used. So it says, an action favourable to the display of exerted muscles and graceful female shapes, in both which points the sculptor has sown great art and knowledge in the execution of this most spirited composition. So I think these are delicate hints at the nature of the scene. In this slightly later catalogue, even that kind of description has disappeared. He writes, a group of a fawn and nymph, small life, found by Domenico de Angelis in the Pianura di Cassio near Tivoli. And then he goes on to talk about the other marbles that were found among the same ruins, which were placed in the Vatican Museum. So this is about emphasising the prestige of his sculpture through reference to the other objects that were found there and have ended up in a prestigious collection. It's completely ignoring and evading the nature of the scene itself. When the sculptures were acquired by the British Museum in 1805, it was this catalogue which was used as the basis of the museum accounting for the sculptures that it had acquired. And the collection was put almost immediately on display in 1808 in a suite of galleries which became known as the Townley Galleries. And a guidebook was produced. And this was the 1808 first edition of that guidebook. And we see that the group of the satyr and nymph was included in the 7th room of Roman antiquities. It's number 1 in that listing, a group representing a fawn and nymph. The size is smaller than life. It continues to be listed in room 7 for the next 3 editions of this volume, which is called the Synopsis of the Contents of the British Museum. But by 1812, the 5th edition, it disappears from the volumes. Clearly it's been removed from display. And by the time that a new register of the Townley material was put together in 1848, it is still being noted as not being exhibited. It's very likely that the reason that this sculpture was removed from display was indeed the sexual content. It was in 1810 that the museum relaxed some of its entry arrangements. Previously, visitors had only been able to come as part of a guided tour. And so the composition of the audience didn't change, but the nature of their interaction with the sculptures would have changed. They could spend much more time looking at individual objects. And that might have raised concerns about members of the audience considered more vulnerable to potential corruption, such as women, children, and members of the lower classes, and the effect that a sculpture of a sexual nature might have upon them. And this is backed up by the document that I now have here, which is the register of the museum's Secretum. This was only drawn up in 1865 or thereabouts, when the museum acquired the Witt collection of erotic objects. But it also included other existing material that the museum owned, which was of a similar nature. And the nymph and satyr is indeed included in this register. It's here as M466, group faun and nymph, he seated on ground and pulling her towards him. Now, the museum secretum was a group of objects that was set aside, essentially, from the rest of the collection. That's secretum in the sense of secret or secreted away. Access to it was much more strictly controlled. You had to apply. There were much more strict criteria for who was allowed to see it. And it's often been thought that it was partly a response to the Obscene Publications Act of 1857. But in fact, it does seem like the museum had been setting sexually themed objects aside as a part of a gradual process over a much longer period. The Secretum collection was dispersed in the early 20th century, and the Townley nymph and satyr goes back on display, certainly by 1984, when a new set of Townley galleries was created in the basements. So we've seen how this object has moved in and out of display over the years. We've also seen how the language has changed, and that's a continuing process. I worked with this sculpture in a series of touring exhibitions internationally in 2008 and 2009, and I've reflected more recently on the language that we used in the display label that we wrote for that exhibition. We used the term attempted rape, and I don't think we thought hard enough about the impact of those words. We didn't really contextualise it well enough. We didn't talk about the restoration of the head and how that affects reading the sculpture. The museum now works very hard to make sure that the language it uses in exhibitions and other content is sensitive and appropriately handled. And that's an important part of my job as catalogue manager. The museum had to rely on handwritten registers like the ones we've seen for many, many years of its history. But now we have the computerised database, and that forms the primary record of the collection. The record for this sculpture was first created in 1993, and it's been gradually improved and worked on ever since in a continual evolving process. I've just recently updated it again. I noticed that the physical description of the sculpture literally just described it as a nymph escaping from a satyr. Now, I would argue it is not at all clear that this nymph is going to escape, and that really elides the violence. So I have amended that to make clearer that the nymph is struggling to escape from the satyr. And I've also added a note referencing the restoration of the head, as well as a subject keyword that references that it is a scene probably of sexual assault. And these kind of improvements are continually ongoing. The records also reference conservation work, publications. So, for example, my own chapter about this sculpture. We enter information about the exhibitions that the object has been featured in, so you can really follow the pattern of what has happened to the sculpture here since it arrived. Those records and collection online really provide a kind of window into the history of objects. But catalogue records are never finished because there is always more to learn, there are changing interpretations and new perspectives are brought to them. And you may have a perspective to bring as well. So you can look at the record on collections online, and if you do see something that's wrong, or if you see something that you think you could add to, that you have more information about from your own research, your own knowledge, then I'd invite you please to send us feedback and help us to enrich and improve our records for the future.